All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Wait.
Go ahead, Aubrey.
I get to do my intro. So, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for the last session in this room today of the 2021 Virtual Christmas Summit, sponsored by Boscoyo Studio. And all of the presentations in this room are specifically sponsored by Lightorama. Our last presentation for today is the motion effect generator, again by Luke Camp. During the presentation, please don't unmute yourself. Apparently you can start your video because Luke loves to see your smiling faces. And you can use the chat to ask relevant questions about the presentation because we can do our best to answer them in chat during the presentation, and then you can ask Luke anything you need to at the end. And with that, I will throw it back to you, Luke. Thank you all for attending.
All right. Thanks, Aubrey. We're talking about motion effects. So we just finished talking about groups, and I think groups are a great precursor to how motion effects work, or vice versa. They kind of work hand in hand. All right. Let me jump to my next slide. All right, so today we are going to talk about motion effect generator. We're going to do a quick overview of what motion effects are, and then we're going to go into a lot of the details, sort of high level to very specific on basic effects, how to mix effects, how to layer effects, what are some of my go-to effects, and then some tips and tricks. So this assumes that you know what a motion effect is to some degree. You've heard the term, and you probably have S5 or S4, the latter versions of S4, to be able to do that. So I think one thing I'd share is that even in putting this presentation together, I learned a lot about motion effects and things you can and can't do. So there's a lot to learn, and I'm not going to cover everything. We're not going to go through every effect, but hopefully I can give you some energy to experiment and test a lot of these different things we're going to talk about. So, quick overview of the motion effect generator. The motion effect generator applies a static or animated video over a group of pixels, AC props, or groups of either of those. And those clips live in timeline squares, much like a traditional effect. So on the right side, I have an S5 sequencer window. Each one of those white buckets would, in a traditional sense of AC channels, represent an on command. But in the sense of a motion effect, it represents a bucket of of an effect, whether that's animated or static. Got a question about me fading in or out. Is anybody else having that issue?
A little bit, but it's not terrible.
Okay. So that's kind of high level what the motion effects are. And then each one of those buckets has a lot of information and customization to it. And once you click into one of those buckets, the motion effect generator opens up, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. So a quick overview. I know most of you probably know this. There's a left side and a right side. It's basically a way to have two different effects at the same time. And then there's a mixer in the middle. So the mixer allows you to pick the left effect or the right effect or something in between. And then below that, you can have some of your favorite effects, and you can save those. Just a couple other quick tips. There's on this bar here, if you can see my cursor right above the colors, there's a reset effect. This next one is for color palettes, so you can save these color palettes. There's a copy and paste to be able to copy and paste them. On the mixer, there's a swap and copy button. So this left one will copy the right over to the left. This one will swap the effects back and forth from the right to the left, left to the right, and then this one on the right will copy the left over to the right. Then you can, like I said, you can save your favorite effects at the bottom. We'll get into some of that a little bit later. And then one other cool tip that I learned I'm right now to be able to hopefully minimize that fading in and out. One thing I learned is you can drag the order of colors in your motion effect window. So I just thought that was kind of something I learned that was kind of interesting, that you can click this and drag it and it will change the color and swap it easily for you. So hope that's helpful for some of you guys out there. All right, so on the motion effect, you can accomplish almost anything if you get creative with combining and transitioning effect. I think that Lightorama's defaults are great, but there's a lot more you can do beyond a lot of the defaults here. So we're gonna walk through sort of four categories, I think, of how to use the motion effect generator effectively. So there's basic effects, which you can kind of see there's sort of these 33 on the right. The bar is the butterfly. what those are. We're going to get into combining and mixing them. We'll get into layering them on the timeline, and then transitions. So basic effects. These are from 5.6.0 Pro, which was released a couple weeks ago. There's 33 of them. And you can see the list here. And these are kind of the basic, what you see is what you get when you open that up. I like to categorize them. I think there's 3 ways to categorize them. There's some effects that are single use. For example, when you play them, they go one time and then they're done, regardless of however long your event is on the timeline. Then there's some ongoing effects that continue to repeat over the course of the whole event. And then there's some either or, and these typically allow you to specify the number of times that the effects are played. So for example, the ripple down on the bottom, you can select how many ripples you want. If it's just 1, if it's 5, if it's 100, or infinite number. So I think that's helpful. This is helpful for me to see so that you can understand when you might use some versus the other. So for example, the color wash is an ongoing or a static effect, whereas some of the others keep going. So when you do a basic effect, when you select it down from the left side here, every effect has sliders or selectors that vary the parameters, which change the effect. So for example, on Garland, you can select how flat or adorned you want it, bottom to top, the spacing, the speed, etc. And every effect, you can change these. When you're working with pixel-based props, you have to select colors for the prop, and those colors come in the order that you have them selected here. So red is always going to be first, green is going to be second, and then so on and so on. Right now I have 2 selected. I have green and black. So green is going to go first and black is going to go, go second. So that's kind of how the colors work. They just go, they go first come, first serve, and then go from there. And like I said, you can drag these and change the order of them. You can make palettes. I'm not going to get into that too much here, but you can click this palette button and you can save custom color palettes and use that to have a lot of different saved palette colors. So that's the gist of every basic effect. When you select a color, your color is for the whole effect duration. But if you click on that color, you can select a color transition or a single color. And then that color transition will occur over the whole length of your event on the sequencer grid. So for example, the red is going to start at the very beginning of the event, and then it will transition to purple over the end of the event. And that's pretty much your option. It's either a solid color or a transition from left to right, or transition from over the whole course of the event. If you want to, let's say, transition the color on the first half and then have a solid color for the second half, you're going to have to combine some effects, like we'll get into later, but that's entirely possible. You just have to get a little creative and think a little bit beyond the level of how the computer works here. So that's color for each effect. And then there's a lot of options, I think, within color transition or color. You can pick a random one. You can have it be transparent or a solid color. You can copy colors back and forth. You can swap them, etc. And you can also save your colors here, which I think is helpful if you if you have a certain color that you like a lot. So that's like I said, basic effects and colors. I called them 1A basic effects because I think 1B is really getting into a deeper portion of how the basic effect works with transition modes. So transition modes are a way to augment those sliders over the course of your effect. And those transition modes are enabled by clicking the lock button on the right side and then selecting one of the options. So basically what it does is the lock icon, which essentially unlocks a transition mode, controls the transition value from start to finish over the length of your timeline cell. So essentially what that is your green becomes the start of your event, the red becomes the end, and then it's going to move from this value to this value over the course of your event. in the sequencer. And I think transition modes are really helpful because they can bring extra movement and additional options beyond a single effect. So if you think about the bar effect, it's going to have a speed, a defined speed of, let's say, 10. But if you use a transition mode, you could have that speed up over the course of your event. You could have it slow down. You could have it speed up and then slow down. You could have it oscillate. You have a lot of options within transition modes. So I think there's a lot to get into with transition modes, but there's a lot they can do for you. So I just took a quick screen clip from the help file of what the different transition modes do. But essentially you have an audio one, which controls the value is correlated to the audio volume. You have an oscillation slider that controls oscillation. You have a damped oscillation, which is what's pictured here. It kind of starts out high and then eventually tapers off to a single value. Then you have a ramp, a back and forth ramp. You have a consistent ramp that's just a linear start to end value. And then you have some acceleration options, speeding up or slowing down. Then you have a step, and then another single ramp, and then a smooth transition. So there's really no right or wrong way to use a lot of these transition modes. It all really depends on the aesthetic you're trying to achieve, but they can do a lot of interesting things for you. So I'd recommend, just if you never used these before or they're confusing, just play around with them a little bit and see what they can do. I would say that in my own programming, I don't use them a lot. I think I actually used this one, the consistent slider, the most, because you're just moving from one to the other. But the acceleration is kind of neat because it can speed things up when you want to have a punch hit or something like that. So I would say just experiment with them. They can do a lot. And then within the customize, at the bottom of the drop down at the lock item, you can click customize transition, and then this window will pop up and you have some additional options for that. So yeah, again, there's a lot you can do here. I would say just experiment with it. All right, so then you have your basic effect, which is really like this left side. And then I think the next level of effects in the motion effect is combining effects. And so the mixer allows you to combine two different effects in a lot of ways. I think we'll get into some of the modes here, but essentially you have a slider and you can pick whether you want the left effect to appear, the right effect to appear, or something in the middle. I think another thing here, this is something I learned, is that when you're selecting a mode, don't forget to move the slider. I can't tell you how many times I've clicked the right effect and I see both effects on the left and the right side, but the middle isn't showing it. Well, it's because your slider's all the way on one side. So make sure you're moving the slider. So these are the different mix types within Lightorama, within the motion effect generator. There's a bunch of mix options. There's a couple overlay options, and then a couple dissolve options. And I think there's really no, what I might say here is there's really, like I said, no right or wrong answer here. They all do different things. I think in my experience, I often use the average. So it's sort of like a transparency in the average. I often use the overlays a fair amount, but they can all do a lot of interesting things in ways you might not understand. Another thing about this is, much like effects, these mix types can have a transition mode. And I think this is how I often use the mixer in my programming, is I'm transitioning from one effect to another effect. And so I think this can give you a lot more options than just a static mix. So again, like I said, I often use the transition modes when I'm using the mixer, just because I think it helps what I'm trying to achieve. And again, the best way to figure out what each does is try them out. A couple other notes that I have here that I just wrote down off to the side is, I often use the first couple of these without a transition mode, like the average or overlay. So the average, for example, it's transparency. So it'll take 25% of the left and 75% of the right, or vice versa. So I'll often use that without a transition mode if I want one effect and then maybe a background color or something behind the effect. But when I get to like an overlay or a mix, maybe on the bottom, when you're mixing the center edges or overlay or even the dissolve, that's when I'll often use the mixer to overlay from the left or to the right to get more of a dynamic effect. If you have a whole, this is a note I have, if you have a whole group and want to mask a portion out or split it, that's where I would not use a transition mode. I would just use the these when they're locked. So this lock icon will show up, and then you can sort of mask out or have an effect apply to one side or the other. But when you're moving, let's say you have one effect and you want to apply another effect, that's when you might use a transition mode. Some commands like the dissolve left right or the right reveals left work in one direction. So for example, this is right hides left. So the right effect is going to hide what happens on the left. That only works in that way. But you can swap the effect by clicking the swap button, and it will essentially do the same exact thing. You just don't have another mixer effect. So they're just trying to save some rows here, but just use the swap button and it'll do the same thing to the opposite side. So that's a way to use some of those if they don't work the first time how you like them. So, and that's the same thing with the right reveals left and then dissolve left right. You'll want to swap them if that's not the exact effect you're going for. And I think one other thing is there's just a lot to demo here, but we can dig into some of this at the end. These overlays, these mix even odd columns, they do a lot. There's a lot of options with all of them. Much like a lot of the other transition modes or the other sliders in each effect, probably more than you'd ever use in your shows, but they just enable a lot of flexibility and creativity there. All right, so that's the second effect. In a second way to do effects is combined effects. The third one we're going to dig into is layering effects on the timeline. So just like you can mix effects in the mixer, just like we talked about, you can also mix effects on the timeline using multiple effect rows. And so I should clarify that you can't necessarily mix with, for example, the overlay or the mix even odd columns, but you can sort of layer them and have multiple effects taking place at the same time by using multiple motion effect rows and multiple effects. Maybe one use case for this is if you want to offset two effects, something that you can't do in the motion effect generator because they play them simultaneously. But if you were to offset the effects on the timeline, you could still do both of those same effects, but you could have a little bit different outcome than you could through the motion effect generator mixer. A couple important things about this is that the S5 sequencer has two layering modes. And this caught me up a little bit. It was a little confusing for me to understand. Basically, you have a blend mode and an overlay mode. So blend mode is maybe before I explain them, these are modes that you apply to the motion effect or to the group itself, or not so much to the individual lines or to a prop. It's really to the group that you're applying it to. So you can have them blend each line or each row of effects, which takes the maximum brightness for each row and applies them across all the motion effect rows. Or you can have the motion effect rows use alpha blending, and that goes from bottom to top. And so I think maybe the blend mode is maybe the easiest to understand. It's just going to layer everything on top of each other, much like you would get in like Photoshop or some other graphics program where you're kind of just layering things on top of each other. The overlay is a little more complicated, but basically it's going to take your effect on the bottom, play that, and then it's going to take the next effect and play that on top of it, but it's going to out what the bottom row is playing. And then the third row will mask, or the top row will mask out the two rows below it. So again, I think this one is a little confusing, but there's two different options for how you can have Lightorama see two events at the same time, or multiple events at the same time. I think for most of what I do, I like the blend because That's pretty intuitive to me because you have one effect and you want to put another effect on top of it. That makes sense. But overlay opens up some additional possibilities that you can't do with the blend. Maybe one example is if you have a red effect and then you have a green effect underneath it. If you use blend, they're going to turn yellow because you have red versus yellow. But if you use overlay, that bottom row is going to take precedent, and it will you'll still get the two colors to come through. For example, if it's two different effects. So blend can be helpful if it's maybe two effects that you're sort of transitioning. But if you're using a couple different effects at the same time, I think overlay might make more sense because then you'll actually get to understand each of them versus just layering all the colors on top of each other. It could get a little jumbled. But again, a lot of options here. I don't always use all of these options, but they're there. Just a quick way to, I put some screen clips on here of how to access this. If you have and I'll just demo this out in real time, but if you have your motion or your sequencer open, you right click on I need to find a group here. Right click on your group definition. That is not what I want. Right click here and then click add modify motion effects. This is where you can pick overlay versus blend in this. There's a question from NJ 2910 about why using the overlay. Why is alpha blending bottom to top instead of top to bottom? I don't know. I wish I had a good answer. It would make sense if it were top to bottom because that's intuitively how you think. You want the thing on the top to take precedence and then anything below it sort of is masked out. But the developers of Lightround thought differently. So you're just going to have to flip your perspective of how that works. It's going to take the bottom, render that first, and then layer everything else on top of it. Kind of like a cake. Your bottom first, and then the other things on top of it. All right, I know we're getting close on our time here. I have a couple more slides left. The last one is transitions. And I think transitions, they're not technically a motion effect in themselves, but they're a good hack to be able to transition and utilize motion effects more in a different way as well. So there's a hold effect in the motion effect generator, and you can, that only works after a previous motion effect. And what that does is it holds or pauses the last effect for the duration of the cell. So you have to have two effects for this one. Your first one is any one of the other 32 effects. Then the one behind it is hold, and it will hold that effect it basically pauses it all the way until the end of that hold event. So again, not a motion effect, but it's a motion effect in itself, but it's the way to use the timeline to your advantage. One other thing that I think can help you get some interesting effects is the back-to-back effect. And I call it a back-to-back effect in quotation marks because it's not a legitimate effect, but it's a function of how the software works. If you have the same effect back-to-back, the effect is going to continue without restarting. But you can switch colors and the effect, whether it's bars or spirals, will continue all the way through. And you can almost have two different effects there, but it's continuous. It doesn't break. Whereas if you take two effects normally and put them back to back on a timeline and have different settings in each of those effects, it's going to restart the effect for the second effect. So that's why I call it effect in quotation marks, but it's essentially a hack to have some additional flexibility out of the effects. So again, I would suggest playing with this a little bit more, but as I already said, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's a good hack. I think that's helpful. So this is kind of explains that you have two effects, the colors are different between them, and then the actual effect, the bars, continues all the way through. And I think I use this often to fade to a solid color between three or more effects. So if I have a red and then I want it to go to black or transition between this to another effect, I'll use a color transition in between to make those color transitions between three separate effects. And then a pro tip here, combine the mixer. You can combine this with the mixer to transition complex effects. And this is kind of like an inception moment. There's you can do things effects inside of the mixer, inside of timeline effects, and get super complicated if you want to it enables a lot of flexibility. So just a quick things to wrap up. My go-to effects, I don't have any matrices in my display, so I don't use like a lot of maybe the more fancy effects, but I use a lot of blended bars, a lot of curtain, color wash, fire, single block. Those are probably my top 5 effects. And then mixer effects, I use a lot of right reveals left, because you can have an effect and then the right side will reveal something, reveal what's happening on the left side. So that one's a cool effect. I use the average a lot just to get 2 different effects visible. Dissolve, which is really a fade. I use that to fade between 2 effects. And then mix center edges is another one that I often use a lot. So just if you're curious, this is what I use a lot. And then another cool thing, tips and tricks, this came out in 5.6.0. So if you don't have this version, go get it. There's some new Lightorama shared favorites. And this is a repository of some really cool effects that Lightorama created that are pretty complicated, but cool to see how other people do it. So this shows up in your favorite effects window. And then these will be changed on a regular basis or added to over time. But there's some like 20 or 30 effects right now, which are really cool. I'd recommend you take a look at them. One other cool thing I found in preparing for this is that you can have the first 4 letters of your effect name show up on the grid. So if white and gray bars like this are complicated, if you put the text on it, you can actually see what each of those effects are. So it's a good hack. This is in your sequencer preferences. So in summary, I know we have a couple minutes left. There's a lot of ways to turn your lights on and off. You can use basic effects, mixed effects, layered effects. You can combine them on the timeline. I think the biggest thing here is to experiment with them. Start small and continue to build your repertoire as you get more comfortable with the different things. And then I think the last thing is utilize the favorite effects palette to see your own and others' shared effects. As I was scrolling through there were some things I never knew were possible, even like with the meteor command that you can do in Lightorama. So that's a great place for inspiration, or to take those and modify them and tweak them for your own. So with that, I'll open it up to some questions. If anybody has questions on what we're talking about, drop in the chat or feel free to speak up.
I didn't get the back-to-back. Is that where you use the hold? Because I thought when you put an effect back-to-back, it'll erase the second one and it'll make it equal to the first one. And I always get frustrated. Like you can't, like you said, transition when you have 2 side by side. So do you make the second one a hold effect? How do you?
So you can put 2 effects back to back just like this. So I have the bars and then the bars. If they're not identical settings, the effect is going to restart at the second one. The only thing, color is irrelevant. It's really the effect settings. But if the effect settings are identical, for example, if you copy paste and then change the color, the effect is going to continue, just the colors will change. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So in this one, I don't know if you can see it very well, but I'll just copy this over. But the effect continues through, but just the colors change on the candy canes down here. So
another solution to that is to use 2 different motion effect rows like Luke has set up here, where you can see effects 1 and effects 2. Just like if you need to visually separate that for yourself about when the effects change, that's a really easy way to do that.
Yeah, I did that, but I thought I did that because if I had them in the same row, it would always overwrite. So then
nope,
I would.
Nope.
No? Okay.
Yeah. So if you have them on separate rows, they'll actually restart. You can see it. Yeah. They'll actually restart on this one, but if you put them back to back, they will not restart if the settings in here are identical.
Okay.
So, any other questions or thoughts? Again, I'll throw my email up if I'm on the forums, or if you want to shoot me an email about questions. There's a lot you can do here. So, all right. Question from B. Miller. How would you compare the effects available now in 5.6 versus some of the other effects in Superstar? I have never used Superstar. Like, I've opened it twice in the 15 years that I've owned Lightorama software, so I can't comment on that. So maybe some others can, but I'm not able to. So. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. We'll see you again tomorrow with some more sessions in the afternoon, and hope you were able to learn something.
All right. Thank you so much, Luke. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us for the presentation. And thank you again to our sponsors, Boscoyo and Lighter.